Hey everybody, welcome back to Cityscape Brewing. I'm Dennis Fields, and today we're talking all things fermentation. We're on episode 6 of our Pints and Process series, where we're going to break down each one of the brewing steps a little bit more in depth than we would during, like, say, an all-grain brew day video. So in this episode, we're going to talk all things fermentation, from pitching your yeast to yeast rates to temperature control and everything in between. So with that, grab yourself a pint, hit that like and subscribe button, and stay tuned. All right, so what is fermentation? Well, in simple, it's the chemical breakdown during a process where a substance gets broken down by either bacteria, yeast, or another microorganism, and that process is known as fermentation. That's a really short, simple example, but we use fermentation for all different kinds of things, for producing food and beverages like pickles and kombucha and kimchi and yogurt, and of course wine and beer, right? So fermentation is also naturally occurring in our bodies. We have fermentation actively going on inside of our gut. This is a normal process of breaking down your food, for instance, inside of your intestinal tract. And so all animals have fermentation going on inside of them. But specifically in beer, the yeast that we add to our wort, which has sugars in it, so sugar water, the yeast eat those sugars and it converts those sugars into, and the byproduct is alcohol, right? So this is how we get alcohol in our beer. This is what turns our wort into beer, is because of this fermentation process. So we're really going to cover 4 main points of the fermentation process: yeast and pitching your yeast, temperature control, when to know to use a blow-off tube, and then how to check when fermentation is done. So first, pitching your yeast. Pitching your yeast is really about how old your yeast is, how high is your original gravity of your beer, and if you need to make a starter or not based on those couple of things. And so a kind of a good rule of thumb, if you have original gravity that's over 1050 or 1.050, I would plan on making a starter. However, you could make a starter for a beer that's a lot less than that if you have an older yeast or you don't have as many viable cells in that pack for some reason. There's a lot of good yeast calculators online, including the one that I use on Brewer's Friend. You punch in a bunch of this information. It tells you what, put in what yeast you're using, the expiration date, and then it will tell you whether a starter is needed based on the beer that you're brewing, right? So for lighter beers, you probably wouldn't need one if your yeast is fairly new, or at least within a couple of months. If you're reusing a yeast that you've just done, you're going to have yeast that's very active. You shouldn't need a starter. If you have yeast that has been a little while in your fridge that you're reusing Trub, which I do all the time, I generally try to use that within 4 weeks. And if I don't, then the cell count goes down, and then either you have to make a starter out of it, or I just usually pitch it and start a new starter off of a different vial of yeast that I buy. Alternatively, you can harvest your own yeast. I've done that from commercial beers. I have a video on how to do that. You can take commercial beers such as any Bell's beer, like Bell's Two Hearted Ale, and you can actually get the little tiny bit of yeast on each one of their bottles, create a small yeast starter, and then convert that into a bigger yeast starter and use their own yeast. So there's a bunch of different ways of getting a yeast, creating a yeast starter. I'll put those videos in the link description below so you can do that yourself. And then how to make a yeast starter. So some people, say, okay, I have a vial of yeast. It's got an expiration date that's, getting pretty close, or it's at least a little older. I probably need to make a starter, or maybe I'm making a really heavy beer and I really want to make sure I have enough cell count. I'm going to go ahead and make a starter. Well, how do you do that? Basically, it's a mixture of dry malt extract, right? And then water, and you boil up a little tiny batch of wort, and you pitch your yeast into that, and it basically multiplies the yeast. And I have a video on how to do all of that entire process. I'm going to link that in the video description as well, and I'll also put it up here in the video. So you can go ahead and click that. That's how you make a yeast starter. Yeast and adding your yeast is probably one of the more important parts, so you're not stressing out your beer, right? So if your yeast either has too little cells, it can make esters that you don't want. It can create off flavors that are undesirable in your beer. So you want to make sure you're pitching a healthy amount. It's very hard to over pitch, even though you can do that. So having a yeast starter, it also gets the yeast kind of familiar with what they're going to do. You've kind of introduced it to some wort already. It kind of understands what it needs to do, and then when you pitch it in your beer, sometimes you can see airlock activity and fermentation already starting within just a few hours of pitching your yeast. And that leads us on to the second point, which is temperature control, right? This is probably, out of all the steps, there's a lot of steps that are very important, but temperature control, especially during fermentation, during active, especially the very beginning part of fermentation, is probably the most important thing that you can do to make good beer consistently. And so, as you know, sometimes you could put your beer in a basement and it's cool in the wintertime, but not as cool in the summertime. That happened to me. I'd make great beer in the wintertime, and then I'd wonder, what's going on? I'm making these beers and they all have kind of off flavors in the summertime, and I really didn't understand when I first started brewing how important temperature control was, especially during the summer months. Now I brew in my garage. It's hot in my garage all the time. And so I use a fermentation chamber to make sure that my beer stays cold, or at least in that temperature range for the yeast, all of the time. And so, for ale yeast, that could be upper 60s to low 70s. For lagers, you need to get them down to the mid to low 50s. And so it's super important to have a vessel in order to do that. I have a video on how to make a fermentation chamber. I have one behind me that I use for virtually every single one of my beers, just to make sure that the yeast is in the optimal temperature range to brew beer, depending on the yeast strain, of course. So I talked in my last video a little bit about Kvike yeast. They like it really hot. I mean, they can get upwards of 90 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and it actually loves that temperature, and it actually creates esters that people perceive as good tasting, and it would be floral and citrusy flavors from those Kvike yeasts, and so those would be perfectly fine to do at higher temperature. So if you're not one that has a way to do temperature control, a Kvike yeast might be a good option for you. However, most ales and lager yeasts are going to have a range that's lower than just your living room temperature, for instance. And so it's very important. A lot of yeasts are going to get into the upper 60s. And remember, even though you may set your temperature in your house to that, or maybe your basement stays at temperature, the activity inside the fermenter as it's fermenting generates heat. So your room could be at 72 degrees or 71 degrees, which may be in the range that your yeast says it's going to be good, but the action inside of the fermenter is actually going to cause the temperature to increase and could cause some off flavors. So what I would suggest doing is making a fermentation chamber where I use the chest freezer, obviously, for cooling, but then I also have a heat source in there. I have a lizard lamp that has a ceramic bulb in it. That actually prevents the beer from getting too cold, right? Say the cooling element turns on in my fermentation chamber and it starts cooling down, and then it keeps cooling down even though the fridge is shut off because it's cold, or the chest freezer shut off. Well, the lizard lamp can kick on and it keeps the beer within a couple of degrees at all times, and that's super important. And that leads off to the next step, which I'm going to talk about, is when you need a blow-off tube. And a lot of people are wondering, well, what is a blow-off tube? Well, basically what a blow-off tube is when you have a very vigorous fermentation and you have a lot of beer in your fermenter. Say you have a fermenter that holds 6 or 6.5 gallons, and you have a really vigorous fermentation. It could have that krausen could come up quite considerably to the point where it's actually blowing out of your airlock. And so I almost always use a blow-off tube when I feel like there's going to be either a really vigorous fermentation or when there's not a lot of room or headspace in my fermenter. And so say I've filled it more than I normally would for certain beers, or maybe I just have more of a volume for a specific beer, then I'm going to use a blow-off tube for sure. And essentially what that is instead of having your airlock out of a bung or the top of whatever your carboy is, whatever your fermenter is, you're going to have a tube that leads out of that area, whether that be out of a bung as well, and it will go into a jar or a cup or a what have you, of sanitizer. And it's going to end up being a similar thing. It's going to be like a larger version of an airlock. But what it allows it to do is have that krausen go through the tube into this glass mason jar. So the blow-off tube literally just prevents you making a mess of your area, whether that be your fermentation chamber like mine, or be inside of your house or your living room or wherever you're fermenting. It just makes sure that you're not gonna expose your beer to oxygen and make a huge mess. And so super important, especially if you have a really vigorous fermentation. And you can change that. If you see that it's starting to creep up high, you can change your airlock out for a blow-off tube at any time. And then the last point I want to talk about today is how to know when fermentation is done, right? So you have gone, it's been about a week since you pitched your beer. Obviously you can see the airlock activity going crazy. You knew it was in fermentation, but how do you know when you get to the next step? Whether that's transferring to a secondary or bottling or whatever you're doing next. Really the only true way to know is to actually do a gravity reading with a hydrometer. However, you can do a couple of other things if you don't have one or you don't want to open your carboy up or bucket or whatever. You can check to see if the krausen has dropped, right? So during high fermentation, you're gonna have a big, thick foam cap on the top of your beer. And if you have a glass fermenter like mine, you can see that, and you can see that it's still going on and it hasn't dropped down into the beer yet. So then you know that there's some fermentation still going on. Obviously, you can look at the airlock or your blow-off tube and you can see if there's bubbles still coming out of there. But you could still have a little trickle of bubbles every minute or two, and still fermentation could be basically done at that point. However, it could also need a few more days to really just help finish and clean off that beer. So in most cases, I let primary go for an entire week. Even when I use Kveik yeast, which is really fast, I noticed that Kveik yeast can finish a beer in 3 days, however, or maybe even 2 days, right? However, the last couple of points in the gravity still need a few days to really finish out. So even when I do use Kveik yeast, I still let them sit for a week. And I've noticed that, although you could get away with it in 2 or 3 days, you'll get the final gravity and it really, really slows down after a couple more days. And so you're really still waiting about a week for Kveik if you really want to get to the potential gravity that yeast can bring it to. And so the true way is to take a hydrometer reading. So if you've taken a look at your carboy, the krausen has really dropped down back into your wort, the airlock activity has stopped, take a hydrometer reading and see where you're at. If you're close to your fermentation or your final gravity, then I would suggest either transferring to a secondary or cold crashing or whatever is happening next. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about in episode 7, is transferring to a secondary. It is going to be how to add hops or fruit or something else to a secondary after primary fermentation is done, and what the benefits and suggestions are about secondaries in general. Some people never transfer to a secondary. Some people do for certain beers because they want to add hops or fruit. Some are, like hazy IPAs, I generally don't transfer to a secondary. So we're going to talk about all things secondary in episode 7, which is the next one in our beer Pints in Process series. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button below. Helps the channel out tremendously, and I appreciate every one of you guys. As always, I'm going to have the links to the videos that I discussed and any equipment that I used in the video description below, so feel free to check those out. Also, leave any questions or comments in the comment section. I love seeing and helping out other people. Doesn't bother me at all. Feel free to ask any questions. With that, happy brewing and cheers.